Hello, it is Austin from Plebdevs here, and I'm going to be continuing my sort of beginner tutorial series, beginner coding tutorial series, which I think we're about 3 deep here. And this one is called JavaScript DOM. So this is going to be our second time kind of writing and learning about JavaScript. And we're going to go a little bit deeper, and you're going to kind of see a lot of the power of JavaScript in this lesson specifically. But we're going to go through this very quickly. And so, yes, let me show you a few links up front. Yeah, so you can get the links to these slides right here, tinyurl.com/plebdevs-js-dom. And that will get you to these slides. There's code in here. There's other links, stuff like that. We've got the finished project right here, which I'll show you in a second. And then we actually have the beginner tutorials playlist. So I set these few videos aside. You can find this playlist right here, and I'll add this video to it as well. So we're just 3 lessons deep here, where we started with HTML and CSS, basically laying out some basic UI on a web page. And then we started to make it a little bit functional and dynamic with JavaScript, which is the real programming language we want to get into here. And so we're just going to continue that today. And if you don't know Plebdevs, you can go to plebdevs.com. We are just a app development community for learners, for new coders, and focus on Bitcoin and Lightning and a lot of stuff like that. And so everything that I cover in these beginner tutorials, I mean, we go in much more depth in our courses here. Lightning Wallet front end is where you'd want to start if you're brand new to coding. We cover all the concepts in here, and then we move on to the back end. We also have a community that you can join on Discord, and of course our YouTube, which has lots of workshops and videos like this. Okay, cool. So let's continue. So we've got the finished project right here. I'll go ahead and show you. It's not too different from what we had before, but basically it's just showing us the Bitcoin price. It's showing us the time. And then we can now toggle the visibility, and we can refresh the price manually whenever we want. So refresh. Yeah, and it won't change every microsecond here, but we'll kind of see how this works. And of course, this is building off of the last lesson, which was the JS tutorial, which is right here. It's extremely similar. We're just adding a little bit of logic in here. It's not letting me run it. That's okay. Either way, it looks very similar. It just doesn't have the time, and it doesn't have these buttons there. So we're mainly just focused about learning these concepts and getting some simple examples down. And I hope you take this ugly web page and make it a lot cooler with what you've learned in the lessons. Sweet. So prerequisites, we kind of talked about this, but basic understanding of HTML and CSS. And it would be good if you completed the previous tutorial on fetching the Bitcoin price using JavaScript. Cool, so these are the concepts we're going to go over. So introduction to the DOM, which stands for Document Object Model. We'll talk about that in a sec. Accessing and modifying HTML elements using JavaScript, which is really the heart of what we're trying to do here, is make our UI dynamic with JavaScript, with the code that we're actually writing ourselves. So creating new elements that we append to the DOM, right? So basically just creating new elements with JavaScript, and then handling user interactions with event listeners, which is really cool. So let's get into it. This is the DOM, the Document Object Model. The DOM is a programming interface for HTML and XML documents. It represents the structure of a web page as a tree-like hierarchy of objects, and each object in the DOM tree is called a node, representing an HTML element, attribute, or text content. Right, so it's just, the DOM is just this representation of our UI that's standardized, and it starts at the highest possible level of the document. So there's this document object at the top level that lets us access everything else down in the tree. And so as a web dev, you'll be interacting with the document object quite a bit, especially with JavaScript. So that's the real heart here of this concept of what the DOM is. It's structured like a tree, So it has structure to it, standardized, and that from the document of the top level, we can start to access the nodes below and edit them and change them and add behaviors to them and stuff like that. So accessing and manipulating the DOM. So JavaScript provides various methods and properties to access and manipulate DOM elements. You can select elements based on their ID, their class, their tag name, or other attributes. So we've mainly used class name when we were learning CSS, right? So you have an element and you put a class name on it. And then with that class name, you can put styles on it. It's basically how it's gone. But here we can actually grab by IDs as well. We can grab by the actual tag name. So let's look at these code examples. We've got selecting an element by ID. Okay, so you can add, so we're just getting an example ID here. And you can add an ID to an HTML tag, just like a class name. Selecting elements by class name, this is what you'll be doing a lot of times. Get elements by class name. And selecting elements by tag name, right? So here we're actually grabbing a div. Maybe you have a footer element, and you can just access it by its name because it's the only footer there. So that's when it's good to use this. But you notice each time we're starting with this document name, and then we're doing document dot. And then there's basically a function here. We call it a method because a method is just a function that lives on an object. I know, weird, but it's basically just a function that we're able to call that's provided to us through the document object. And it just gets our element for us, you know? So that is the usefulness of it. We don't need to implement all of this code from scratch or anything like that. It is built in to the document. Cool. So once an element is selected, you can modify its contents, attributes, styles, or even create and append new elements. Okay, so here in this first example, we're getting an element by ID, you know, maybe it's some div, and then we're able to say .text content, right? There's something else that's provided to us after we grab this element from the document. So we can put in new content, and then we can add new attribute to the element. So data, new attribute, value. That's kind of just an example right there, but maybe you would have some attribute that you'd be looking for some kind of certain functionality. And then below, we have an example where we're changing the style. So we grab an element by ID once again, and we're able to access style, the style object on the element, and change the color to red, to change the font size to 20 pixels. And here we can actually create a new element, which is something really cool. So we say const new element equals document.create element, creating a span, then putting text into that span. And then we use append child to actually append this onto that document object model. So I know this looks really confusing, maybe just looking at it, but it's better once you have an idea of something in mind. Like for example, maybe you have a hamburger menu or something where you click a button and it needs to open up and fill with items, right? This is where you might create a new element. You might target that element and append child inside of it and add menu items inside of your menu. So that's an example of how you might use this kind of stuff. So we've got handling user interactions with event listeners. So event listeners, this is really cool. So event listeners allow you to respond to user actions and events, basically listen for something to happen. Examples of these events might be click, hover, key press, form submission, etc. Event listeners are attached to specific DOM elements. When the specified event occurs on the element, the associated function is executed. Cool, so the prime example on how you'll be using this 99% of the time is right here. We have a button, so we get the button by its ID, and then we're able to say button.add event listener, and this is a function with a first argument that is click, so we're saying this is the type of event listener. It's a click, and then we have a function that fires if click is activated, and it just alerts and says the button was clicked, right? So this is cool. This is different when we got hover, key press, stuff like that. So you can, on your whole page, you could be listening for a certain key press, and you could play a sound or present something to the user. And so you can just have all these events fire off based off of what the user's doing. It's a big idea of event listeners. We've got the link to the docs for event listeners, so you can see all the stuff you can do right here. And then we have another example. What is this one doing? Adding a hover event listener to a div element. Okay, so we grab a div, so just some container, and we add event listener for mouse enter. So when the mouse enters that container, hover div.style.background color equals light blue. So the color of the container changes to blue, right? So that's something you're able to do on hover. Here we have an example of a key press. So on a key press, console log key pressed and show which key was pressed. Okay, yeah, pretty simple. So you can just show that you can listen for any specific key presses or something like that. Cool, so that is event listeners. So we kind of just talked about what is the DOM. We've seen that we can grab elements on the DOM, that we can change their attributes and styles and text content, and that we can actually create new elements and put them onto the DOM. And finally, we see that we can listen for certain events on elements using the DOM and then do things off of that. Cool. So now we'll just implement the very basic bit of code that we have to add to our project here, but it will demonstrate some of these concepts that we've learned. So what we built in our last JS tutorial, it was this. It was this ugly, it just says current Bitcoin price, and it fetches the current Bitcoin price from the Coinbase API. And so this is basically most of the code. So we had an HTML document, and then we have a script tag and a function called fetch Bitcoin price, right? And with this, we are able to create a new XHR object. So this is just to make a request, an HTTP request to Coinbase for the Bitcoin US dollar spot price, right? So we grab XHR, we grab our API URL, and we are able to make a GET request to that API URL. We choose a response type of JSON, and then we wait for that response, and when it's 200, aka it's a good response, we grab it, and then we say the Bitcoin price is equal to response.data.amount. And then we actually, look at this, we are doing DOM manipulation right here, document.getElementById price.text content equals $ plus the Bitcoin price. Okay, and so that's every single time this runs, we update this element in the text content. And then right here, we just send the request to the API. So that was most of it. This was the rest of the code. We have an interval that calls the fetch Bitcoin price every 3 seconds. And then this is our body where we're just saying this is the current Bitcoin price. And then this is the p tag with the span that we actually update with our function right here. Cool, so we're gonna be adding on to that very slightly, but we'll go ahead and make a new Replit project, and I'll do this along with you. So I'll go here to Replit, and I'm going to create an HTML, CSS, and JS Replit. Just take the default name. Okay, and going on to the next slide, I can put in all of the code from the last project. We'll just copy and paste this all over so we have the same starting point from our last project. And if I run this, it should load the Bitcoin price. Yes, I think it takes 3 seconds initially. Cool, so that is in place. Now let's continue on. So first we want to be able to toggle the visibility of the Bitcoin price. So we're gonna have a button just to be able to hide it and show it. I know this doesn't really make sense for the Bitcoin price, but it's the kind of simple functionality that you might use in a lot of web dev projects. So we're gonna grab a new function right here called toggle price visibility. And I'll grab that, and we'll put this inside of the script tag right here, but not inside of the fetch Bitcoin price function, because that's its own function. So I'm gonna make space for this. Okay, toggle price visibility. And what is this actually doing? I mean, this is, so we're grabbing the price element, get element by ID of price, and we're saying if the display equals none, then make the display inline. Otherwise, if not, then make the display none. So it's basically just toggling show or hide or show or hide based off of if it's showing. So I have a nice little if else here, simple function. and then we'll actually put in our button, which will do this. So I'll just pop it right below here. Cool. And we should be able to run that and actually see that it works. So there we go. Toggle it hidden, invisible. Nice. So let's move on. So let's add a button to actually manually be able to refresh the Bitcoin price. Right, and so since we already have this fetch Bitcoin price function, and we already have an interval where we're calling it every 3 seconds, but we can go ahead and just throw down a button, which on click equals fetch Bitcoin price with open parentheses, right? So that is calling this function. So we're able to call it manually here. So let's run this again, and I can refresh the price at any point in time. It doesn't change very often, but it changes a little bit. We see it changing there. Cool, so that was a simple piece we needed to add, just needed the on-click event listener. Okay, now let's add a date and time. So let's copy this first piece of JavaScript code here, and we'll put it in and look at it. So I'll make some space. We'll remove this ... Okay, so function to update the current date and time. So function update date and time. So we get an element by ID date called date time. We're able to say new date. Date is an object that you get by default in the web. And we can say to locale string. This is just a method that gets like the local browser time. And then we're able to put the text content to that. So that's pretty simple. And then we just need the date and time p tag and span that we will populate it with. So let's put this like right here. Save that and we'll run it again. Okay, and it shows 5/19/2024, 2:54 p.m., which is correct for me. So that's awesome. And so we see that we're updating the date time function every second with this set interval. And so just calling that function every second, calling fetch Bitcoin price every 3 seconds, but then of course we can refresh it manually as well. Cool. So this is just, and then on the final slide here, we have all of the completed code from this project, just so you can end up with the same bit that I have here. So yeah, pretty simple additions that we made today, but just start to play with these concepts and play with this idea of a Bitcoin price calculator or a Bitcoin price display web app, and expand the functionality of this because you have a lot of tools at your disposal now. So I hope this was helpful, and keep an eye out for more tutorials where we're going to be learning more about JavaScript and eventually getting into other stuff like React. So keep an eye out for that, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.